Hi. So today I'm going to share with you some information about teaching reading with the language experience approach. Most of the information, or a lot of the information in this PowerPoint, comes from the book Using the Language Experience Approach with English Language Learners, which is available to borrow through the school district, or it's available to purchase on Amazon. Because the book goes into a lot of detail and a lot of depth, I'm not going to talk about all of that detail here. Instead, I'm going to talk about a lot of the common issues that we see with English language learners, particularly English literacy development. Um, and the science of reading and the science behind those problems that we see. And then I'll lead into how to solve these problems using the language experience approach and also um, some follow up activities and a model of when I use the approach with an ELD learner and the kinds of things that I did with it. So, the reason I guess that I've become such an advocate or a fan of language experience approach is because it's so diverse and flexible. So you can do it whole class with a mixed group. You can do it one on one with a student. You could have just your group of English language learners, but ultimately, it's helpful kind of across the board. Students don't need to know a lot of oral language before they can kind of delve into language experience approach either. So even though there are many, many methods to teaching English language learners, I feel like this one is really strong because it gives classroom teachers a tool to use. And if we're doing our conferences and we're doing our daily five, then this gives teachers something that they can do during that time, but also text that students can take away and work with that's on their level. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But certainly, if you're looking for more detail than this presentation gives you, check out the book. There's also some blog posts and YouTube videos that demonstrate the language experience approach and show its use in class. So check those out as well. All right. So first, we're going to start with a 2-minute challenge. I'd like you to take the next 2 minutes and make sense of these phrases. You can use whatever strategies you would like to make sense of them. I'll come back to you in 2 minutes, or you can just pause and come back, skip ahead in 2 minutes. All right. The reason that I showed you this was to demonstrate how we often use reading skills that we don't really know that we're using. So, a lot of the skills that our students, especially ELD students, are lacking are actually pre reading skills that we learned very, very young, usually by being in a literacy rich environment, by being read to, by watching Sesame Street, for example. So, in order to decode these puzzles, you actually had to use some of those pre reading skills. You had to know that the English language is written and read from left to right. You had to know the sounds of all of the letters. You also had to, and this is really important for our learners, you also had to have a large oral language bank to draw from. Because if you didn't have that bank of words that you knew were words, then you wouldn't have been able to apply the sounds that you were seeing and reading and decoding to the actual words that they were supposed to say. So, reading skills like these are transferable. They follow us from our first to our second language. Sometimes we need to make little changes about directionality or certainly about the way that letters sound. But for the most part, we just make those little shifts and we can apply all of the things that we know, including our background knowledge, to a new language. So you had to use these. This is important moving forward. So, reading is an auditory process. We used to think that it was visual, and a lot of our current, maybe falling out of favor now, um, reading techniques or reading strategies are based on the idea that reading is a visual process, but it's actually auditory. So, in brain scans of children decoding new words, we've actually been able to see that although we're taking information through our eyes, we're actually using the auditory part of our brain to read that information. When we read silently, the same areas of our brains activate as when we read aloud. And this is important to know because the relationship between what we read and what we hear is so closely intertwined. So, for our students who haven't grown up hearing the language that they're learning to read, English, this is really important to note because they don't have that big oral language bank. So, even a 5-year-old entering kindergarten for the first time, um, who has never been exposed to literacy, they can learn pretty quickly by mapping the sound system they've developed over the past 5 years to symbols. So, a second language speaker who's never been exposed to literacy must first develop the vocabulary or the oral language bank, and then the sounds of English before they can begin to learn to read. So, even if a kindergarten student grew up not in a literacy rich environment, they're coming to school with an oral language bank. So between 700 and 1,500 words, kind of depending on a number of social factors happening within that child's home, students are coming with that bank. Then they're going to be able to map what they're seeing in the written word to what they already know. So, neurotypical brains learn to speak and listen automatically. That's why if I went to Japan tomorrow and I sat in a Japanese classroom and I listened to Japanese all around me, I would just eventually start to learn the Japanese words that I was hearing. My brain would just kind of click and be able to pick that up. Reading and writing systems are relatively new in human history. So many languages don't have a written form at all. So when we're talking about Somali students, Kurdish students, they have written forms of their language, but those are 21st century inventions. Both of those languages can be written in our alphabet, our English Roman alphabet or in the Arabic alphabet, but they don't actually have their own alphabet, and that's because they've been transliterated by other people. Um, so reading and writing have to be taught. They don't come naturally. And before we ever learn to read, this oral language bank starts to develop kind of in utero. We learn the rhythm of our first language. We listen to our mother speak, and it will continue for our entire lives. So our students who haven't learned to read or write in their first language are really coming at a disadvantage. So if we have two students side by side, one who has their first language literacy intact, one who does not, we can kind of compare their pathway. And this is why when we say that EIL students take about 1 to 3 years to catch up, or 3 to 5 years to be on par with their peers, where ELD students take 5 to 7 years, this is the difference in the time. It's not even necessarily that they're learning slower, it's that it takes that much more time to catch up. So, this EAL student on the left has been exposed to literacy either at home or at school. They learn the English vocabulary and grammar over time and communicate orally. So, this is where things start to branch off. We have our EIL student and our ELD student. They've both learned to speak and listen at a really fluent level, but we see that the ELD student has not learned to read or write as quickly as we would expect. And this is why so many ELD students are being um, I guess, flagged for PLPs, or there's concerns that they have learning disabilities. In fact, this isn't a processing issue. It's just an issue of time on task. So back to our chart, our EIL student can just transfer all of those skills and strategies that we already talked about in the first section. They know about directionality. They know that a symbol makes a sound. They know how to hold a book. They know how to use those pre-reading skills from their first language, even if they're a little bit different, and they just transfer them over. Then they learn English phonics, which for some students is really easy depending on the language distance, and then they begin reading and writing. So this process takes sometimes a year, sometimes 3 years by the time they've kind of caught up, and about 3 to 5 for the academic language. But usually with EIL students, we see this happening pretty quickly. The ELD student, however, has to learn all of these pre-reading skills because they've never learned them, or they've had a gap in education that didn't help them stick in their brains. So they learn their oral language, they're speaking and listening, they're doing a great job, and then they begin to learn pre-reading skills. So this sort of thing can happen in tandem, but it's pretty difficult to learn a language if you can't speak the language, if you don't have any sort of oral language at all, because you need to have that word in your mind, in your memory already before you can apply it. And that's why we say when students are first learning, they're just repeating memorized phrases, but they can't segment those phrases into individual words and make novel phrases from that. Before that process starts to happen, it's really difficult to have a student learn to read in the traditional sense. Of course, they can tell you about a picture, they can describe things, we can talk a lot about what they're seeing, they can tell us about summaries. Maybe they can draw a picture, they can start to copy their letters, but the actual process of reading is difficult to do if you don't have an oral language bank. So they're going to start to learn these pre-reading skills. This takes time because they haven't been exposed to it for the 5 years before they came into K, if these students are coming in K. They're falling behind each year. But we also have to remember that their proximal development is growing. So it's easier for me as an adult to learn a new thing because I have so much knowledge already to pull from. Whereas a child, you can't really reason with them, you can't make sense in like the logic, you can't draw parallels between the two languages. You have to teach them in a completely different way. So that's why ELD students actually catch up quickly if we're talking about relatively in terms of language learning and literacy learning. So then they'll begin to learn to decode using English phonics. Um, Obviously, you're going to start with the alphabet sounds. but then you can move on from there. Then they begin reading, of course, short pattern texts, and then they'll work at their own level. So this takes such a time that if you have a student in first grade or in seventh grade, you're going to see very little growth within that year. And then the growth seems to speed up, at least in my experience, once they kind of get those pre reading skills and they start to really understand English phonics. But we have to really keep in mind that these students are learning to read in a language that's not their own, and they don't have, again, any skills from their first language to apply. So it really is kind of flying blind and learning this whole thing from scratch and building the airplane as we go. So then at the end of the day, EAL and ELD students will both have double the vocabulary of a monolingual lingual speaker, um, because they can read and write and they can speak in both languages. So it's certainly not a processing issue. It's just a time on task issue. And if we can scaffold our ELD students using audiobooks, by reading questions to them, by allowing them to respond orally, then that's going to be all that much more helpful. So this is just to say, sometimes we tend to move really quickly. We think, oh no, they're not learning fast enough, or they're not learning as fast as they should. And we compare ELD students to our EAL students. But that's just a false comparison. The EAL student has a lot more background information in literacy. It's not really great to compare. So if you look at the scope and sequence for word study document that the district has, I believe that the English department has it on their SharePoint here at district. You can actually have a look at the scope and sequence document to see where your student is when they're reading a text, and then where to go from there. The text also gives you examples from the Next Step Forward in Guided Reading, which is a great book that breaks down each step of reading and talks about how to kind of gain mastery over the next step forward. The Next Step Forward in Guided Reading, hence the name. So I would recommend you have a look at this for your ELD students, just to plot them and to say where they are on their reading journey. So I'll also go into the problem with other author texts. So I've become kind of critical recently of the Fontes and Pinnell system for reading, for our EIL students in particular. So if you look at this poem, Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll, it's got lots of nonsense words in it. And the problem is we don't know what those words are. We can decode them, but we can't comprehend them. We have no oral language background for these words. So decoding does not equal comprehension. So sometimes a student will seem like they're really stuck at one Fontes and Pinnell level, but it's often the vocabulary knowledge that's holding them back. It actually has nothing to do with their fluency, with their cognitive ability, with their ability to decode. It's just that they don't have this vocabulary knowledge. So one of my colleagues was talking about how students will have trouble with the word fire engine because a text will have been published in the UK. So the student who speaks English as a first language will come to the word fire, they'll use the pictures, they'll do all of their kind of cueing system, and then the word engine, and they'll say truck, because we don't say fire engine in North America. So this is an issue. The student then wouldn't get that level, perhaps, but it has nothing to do with their actual reading. It has to do with their vocabulary knowledge and the vocabulary that's familiar to them. So I will offer just really quickly that because students are going to see other author texts, we can't avoid that. They're not going to write their own texts to read all of the time. The solution to this is actually modified guided reading. And that's not so different from regular guided reading. It just makes sure that you spend a long time pre-teaching the unknown vocabulary and the unfamiliar grammar structures, and you take maybe your first guided reading session or your first conference session to just go over the text features and just talk about the book. I would not recommend that you do a cold read running record for an EIL student. I don't think that the results are valid, um, particularly when we're looking at ELD students. If you could do it and give them all of the vocabulary that they need, but then I don't know how valid those results would be. So a truer assessment of a child's reading level would be better achieved through pre-teaching of the vocabulary and building the background knowledge. And modified guided reading is designed to do that. So it's designed for children who are a little bit further along on their reading journey. So you would be maybe reading like at an L in that area. But I'm more focused today on LEA because it's inclusive for those readers as well as the beginning readers. But just some caution about using Pontus and Pinnell and running records with EIL students. So the second problem, the first problem is lack of vocabulary in an oral language bank, and the second problem is insufficient background. So I'll let you read this. You can just pause the video and read it. Coming back to it, I grabbed this from the Indian Times. It's written for Indians, so they can read this and they'll easily understand everything that the article is making reference to. It's really unfamiliar for us. So oftentimes when we're thinking about the background knowledge of students, we think that, oh, they just don't understand our holidays. Like they don't really get Christmas, they don't really get Halloween. That's really bizarre for them. But sometimes students come to us with different cultural backgrounds that we wouldn't really expect. So I was reading another text, and they used the example of they quizzed British children and Irish children, and they asked them the same question: what would you do if you found a wallet on the street? So this test was done in the 90s, and the British children all said, oh, I would pick it up and turn it in or whatever. And the Irish children, who came from basically a civil war, said that they wouldn't pick it up at all. So it's not even a language thing. It's your specific culture in your area, in your neighborhood. And this extends beyond just being from a completely different culture or a completely different language background or country. Sometimes we have insufficient background for things that are unexpected. So many of our other author texts talk about experiences that would be common for Western children, children born in Canada, but they're confusing to children from other cultures, and this is a barrier to comprehension. Again, modified guided reading, it can be overcome, but it's often more labor intensive to pre-read a text with a student than it would be to just recreate a text in a new way altogether. So if we ask ourselves the why behind what we're hoping to achieve, and the answer is targeted reading instruction, rather than just getting an assessment and giving a student a letter, then taking the time to front load unfamiliar vocabulary and background takes away from time we could be focused on other word work and reading skills. So it's not wrong, it just the process takes longer. So if you want your student to know all about, sled dogs is the example that I use a lot, then certainly do modified guided reading with them, pre-teach all of that vocabulary. It is going to be helpful to them in the long run because they're probably going to encounter a lot of this just throughout their life, and it's important for them to understand it. But if you only have, 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day to help these students with really targeted reading instruction, you might want to stay away from kind of the traditional guided reading or modified guided reading and go straight to language experience approach, which I'll talk about. So, language experience approach in its simplest form is first you have a common experience. And this, I think, can be people or teachers who are really busy and overwhelmed here have a common experience and they're like, we don't have time for that. A common experience can be you watch a video, you have the student do an observation on a kindergarten class is one of the things that's mentioned in the book. For the example that I'm going to give you, actually didn't have the experience with the child. I just used the prompt, tell me about a day that you had with your friends. So it can be super simple, or it can be more elaborate, like a science experiment. I have a mentor who's making slime with her students. Then you write a text with the child that has a familiar context so they can make a connection to the text itself. So we're eliminating the they don't know these words oral language barrier because they're going to tell us the story. So we know that they have all of these words intact. Um, and we're also overcoming the problem of unfamiliar background because they're telling us the story. That's how it's going to be. This is also really, really helpful if your students have just checked out and lost all confidence in their ability to read. I've seen really great things happen with student confidence when teachers use the language experience approach. Non-readers suddenly feel like they can participate in the reading, even though they're not going to be decoding right away in some cases. They're still reading and using those pre-reading skills to decode the text. So finally, you use your co-constructed text to guide your reading intervention and lessons. So this is typically done in a 5-day cycle. It doesn't need to be done in a 5-day cycle. You can adapt it however you want. I wouldn't leave too long between cycles or between new texts. And the idea is at the end of this, your student will have a language bank that they can take with them, but they'll also have a written text. So if it's read to self time, they can have their duotang of texts that they can read and they can use that for read to self. Then they can go through, your bookshelf and they can find those words in other author texts. We're building really slowly, but we don't have the barrier of the oral language and the unfamiliar context to contend with. So I'll show you an example that I did. So together we created the text. This was Moses's story. Again, the prompt was tell me about a fun time you had with your friends. I wrote it exactly the way that he said it. We didn't correct it. You can correct later, but I wouldn't correct right away. I would do that after we read it a few times together. Then we read it together, either as a class or just one-on-one in this case. Then I took it home and typed it. So I typed the whole thing. I am with my friends, and then create a language bank in order. So this is important to do because the next day, day 2, they're going to read from those words. So you're going to give them to them. The context is not removed at this point. So your student is pretty quickly going to realize that these words are in the order of the story. So I've just put them all in order. I don't repeat the words that appear more than once. It's not necessary. And then you're going to make a note of which words they knew right away and which words they didn't. The words that they knew right away are going to become their known words. And then we're slowly going to remove the context for these so that they get mapped in the brain as words that the student can read. So day 3, you're going to scramble their list of known words. So let's say this is a list of all of his known words. I just took them in Word and I scrambled them up, typed them again. And then I'm going to have him read them to me again and check off the ones that he knows. Again, I've only given him words that he knew the day before, or she knew the day before, but I've just slowly kind of cranked it up a notch by removing some of the context, which is the story order. Then day 4, you're going to give a new scrambled list of the words that the student knew on day 3. So the book notes that this will be the hardest because so much of the context has been removed. But our goal is to have students read these words and see them out of context. So when they encounter them in another author text, they'll recognize them. The book does say if a student struggles, you can have them just look at the original text and find the word in there. We never want to create a situation where a student feels so frustrated that they give up or that they don't continue reading just for the sake of being right or wrong. I mean, to me, if you have a student who's just learning to read or just learning to read in a second language, then you should give them every opportunity for success. Then day 5, you give the known words on word cards. There's no reason that you couldn't have the student write these themselves. I probably would. And then you could keep them on a ring, like a card ring, and the student can take them with them to class. Or they can just keep them in a Ziploc bag. They can keep them with you. It doesn't really matter. But at the end of it, you've pared down all of the words from the story, and now they know these words. So these are words that they can go and see out of context in another author text in their classroom, and they will know them. Some of them will be sight words. Some of them they probably will have known already. The number doesn't actually matter, but what's neat is then when you create another text, they're going to be able to immediately recognize their known words in the next text. They could take these words and use them in sentences. You could scaffold and scramble sentences. You could give them like a close activity with their first project, however you want to kind of reinforce this. So each day actually doesn't take that long. The first day, when you create the text, is the longest. I would say that takes about a half an hour. But then each subsequent day is maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And you can also do word work with these. So that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute. So for extension, you've got your student dictated texts, you've got your other texts, and you want to give opportunities to write as well. So there's no reason you can't do these things all in tandem. So what I would do, because if you remember Moses's text, it was about Minecraft, is create a kind of a text set. So I would bring in books about that topic and we could read them together. He could just look through them. He could find, like I said, match his words with the text. By this point, he probably knows the word Minecraft right away. So we've, again, created chances for success, but we've also created an interest in books. So now I know some words. Let me see these other books and see if I can apply the words that I know to these other books. And we're scaffolding that for him. So this writing sample is from another student. I actually didn't do writing with the first student right away. So if they give you a writing sample, so let's say students are at about this stage where they can do some basic writing, they give you a writing sample. It is often tempting to look at this and say, oh no, this kid is way behind. But in fact, usually students are somewhere on the spectrum of the stages of writing. So if we look at this picture, we start with pictures. Then students start to kind of squiggle. They start to use some letters. Gradually, they move into more logical spelling, using vowels correctly. Inventive spelling is kind of in the middle, and then they're writing. So we forget about all of these stages, I think. We just kind of start to panic when we first see, oh no, they're not spelling correctly or they're using inventive spelling, there must be something wrong. But in fact, the process goes really quickly. Um, a lot of students will skip kind of the pictorial level unless they don't have the oral language yet, or they won't scribble. They'll just immediately start to use consonant sounds in their writing, depending on the age and what your focus is. So you can take this text. I've noted that the student is at the inventive spelling stage, and they've got some vowel sounds intact. So now I can take vocabulary from the student-generated text, if I want to, and do word work with this writing stage in mind to move them forward. So I'm going to look at the text and I'm going to say, oh, at the inventive spelling stage with vowels, I know that to move to the next phase, they need to work on word families and vowel sounds. So I'm going to look through their text. If I was using this one, I would say, oh, he's got a lot of ing words in there. So that's the first word family that we'll work with. So what I'm going to recommend today that you do, just for the sake of an example, is this process. So teaching word families, because I think that a lot of students are stuck at that inventive spelling stage. You'll see that, or I see it a lot, and they've been here for a while. So it's kind of like, what's happening here? What's going on? So first, this is called read to spell. No, sorry, this is called spell to read. Okay, so first I'll ask students to spell the word swing without showing them the word swing. They'll spell it however they want to, whatever they think is right. Then I will have them say swing and show them how it's spelled. I'll allow them to correct their own spelling by looking at my example. Then I will explain the rule that ing sounds like ing. It makes that sound every time. And I will introduce 5 ing words to practice with. So they don't all have to end in ing. They can have mid ing. Doesn't really matter. And I'll ask the student to plot in sound boxes. So the sounds that we hear in swing are swing. So S, W, and then ing goes together because it's actually just one sound. So I would then use a second word family from the text, and the second word family should be very different from the first. So in this case, I chose the AY word family. That's just to eliminate confusion. And then I'll use an analogy chart. So what I'll do is I'll take my ing 5 words, I'll take my AY 5 words, I'll call them out one at a time, and I'll have students just chart them really simply. Is it an ing word or is it an AY word? And again, this process is slow, but it's very targeted, and you will see examples of progress from here. So the idea is that they're working on their reading, but they're also working on their writing at the same time, and they're making those connections with bigger chunks of text. So especially if they're struggling with using blends, or like I say, with using word families and larger chunks, they're only using vowels some of the time. A lot of consonant sounds are represented, but not a lot of like blends or digraphs. Then definitely this is a great approach. I've linked a video to it at the end of this presentation. You can watch the author explain how she uses and model how she uses analogy charts from there. So that brings us to the end. So if you want to know more about the science of reading, we've got a book available called How the EAL Brain Learns to Read by David Sousa, who also wrote How the Brain Learns to Read. There's a Scientific America article on when we read, we recognize words as pictures and hear them spoken aloud in our heads. Criticism of Fontes and Pinnell for early reading instruction. This is a blog post with a podcast embedded. Even if you're a big Fontes and Pinnell fan, it's fine. I think that the podcast is really interesting because it really goes into the science of how these students are learning to read, and it interviews some little kids. And if you're interested in that kind of like in reading development and that kind of brain science, then check that out. Again, the video on analogy charts and a video on language experience approach for secondary. So I tried to be inclusive. I know that the examples that I showed were elementary examples, but I think that we're seeing students across the board who could use this. Certainly, even though that student was an elementary writer, I think that there are ELD students in kind of 7 to 12 who would write at a similar stage in writing. So just getting them to move forward. So just showing how language experience approach works in the secondary EAL classroom. If you're a content EAL teacher, there's also language experience approach for the content areas that is outlined in this book, and how you would use it there. If you are a literacy teacher, you can use it class-wide. I'm sure that there are students in your class who would benefit from it. I guess my biggest takeaway, or the biggest thing that I've seen happen, is that students' confidence increases. So at a point, kids realize that everybody else is moving beyond me, and why would I even try? Why would I embarrass myself? Um, and why would they? I think I would feel the same way. So this really heightens their confidence while also gives them opportunities to read in context things that they will understand. So if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me or a member of our EIL team. And thank you for watching.